Hello, my name is Natalie Lucas, and I'm the Executive Director of Care About Climate. I'm going to be talking to you today about the history of the United Nations climate negotiations.
So you may have heard of like Rio Plus 20. That was a conference that happened a couple of years ago because over 20 years ago, countries came together to deal with three different issues in 1992 that were cross boundary, and countries on their own couldn't really deal with them. We really needed to take care of them in a global space. And so that was the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there are COPs, Conference of the Parties, for each of these bodies, and they have conversations. So you have a COP for the Convention on Biodiversity, and you have a COP for a Convention to Combat Desertification. So, and that just means the Conference of the Parties who has actually signed on to this agreement. And so that's their discussion. There are a couple of different, so you can have agreements under this like document of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is something that the US is like signed on to, and you can make international legal decisions under those, and that those are COP decisions. When you then start thinking about other agreements that aren't covered by this document, and I can send you the original document that outlines UNFCCC, that's when you start getting into spaces where more negotiation needs to happen, because it may not be under the rules of the UNFCCC. This is really complicated, but I'm kind of just setting up like how it works. So you have this like document that sets it up, and then you have the COP, which is the parties discussing under the rules of the UNFCCC. The first COP took place in 1995. And then the Kyoto Protocol was signed in 1997. So at like COP3, basically. And now we're at like COP26. So you can kind of see how long this conversation has been happening, which is all really unfortunate. And so just to give you a little bit more background about the Kyoto Protocol, because it does have impact on even today's conversations. So with the Kyoto Protocol, 37 countries signed on, and it was a way to like operationalize the convention that everyone had been just signed on to a couple of years prior. Basically, the developed countries were to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions through the CDM, which is a clean development mechanism. And basically that's carbon markets and things like that. And this matters because they're still having a lot of conversation about whether or not the carbon credits they had purchased, like countries had purchased under Kyoto, apply to Paris. And they're still having conversations about that as we speak. And so that's like, because some of the developing countries like Brazil and others who have a lot of these credits that are just like, hey, we got a lot of money because you had this, we like preserved our forests, and if you just like wipe that away, then what was that all for, sort of thing. There's questions around that and whether or not it should still exist. So there were two commitment periods. One was 1997 to 2012, and then 2012 to 2020. And so when Paris was introduced, it was really thinking about like what happens post Kyoto, which is why like the 2020 conversations were so important. And that's why it was a big deal last year that we didn't have the conversations, because we needed to like, we were supposed to like really close the book on Kyoto, and Paris was supposed to be the ultimate document. So that's kind of where we are, and that's why I bring it up now. And COP, and obviously I'm skipping quite a few COPs, like we're going from Kyoto to COP 13. I'm just highlighting really big things that were particularly important. So COP 13 in Bali was particularly important because they created this long-term cooperative action. And this was like thinking about like, how do we actually reduce emissions long-term past this first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. It also put into a box the different pillars that people were starting to think about climate action through. So like having a shared vision, like what is this global goal, was one of the big questions. What do we need to stay under? what adaptation was becoming a lot more of a conversation because mitigation wasn't working. Well, not that it wasn't working, it's just that we weren't doing it. Technology transfer and how you move people from like, are we starting with coal-fired power plants, or are we just like helping people get to solar, or like what does battery storage look like, etc. Mitigation became a huge conversation, and then finance. I think this frames up pretty well a lot of where like the conversations have sort of like been boxed in around climate conversations since then. So then in Copenhagen, they tried to, this is, they were basically trying to make, this was in 2009, they were trying to make a post-Kyoto, but pre-second commitment period of Kyoto, discuss like agreement. So they were trying to do a Paris agreement in Copenhagen, basically, but it ended up failing, mostly because the United States was going and undermining a bunch of stuff and not allowing it to happen. And some of you may have been here. I wasn't actually at Copenhagen, but this was supposed to be like a pivotal moment because Obama had just been elected, and like we thought that we would be able to like really get on board with like serious climate action, and then it just didn't happen. So after Copenhagen, they were really trying in COP15 to rebuild trust. And this is where like some of these big numbers started coming into play because of the failure of Copenhagen. So COP16 in Cancun, countries has agreed to stay below 2 degrees Celsius because that is when tipping points actually happen. And then they were supposed to review the 2 degrees Celsius goal in 2015, which they did during the Paris Agreement, which is how they got to the 1.5. The review is and Todd, this is kind of going to your question a little bit. When they were reviewing it, they could have kept it at 2 degrees, and it was actually a huge sticking point because climate vulnerable countries really wanted it at 1.5, because even at 1.5, islands are submerged. And well, I mean, I don't have to tell you all of this stuff, like it's bad. And so it did, and they were also making the argument it doesn't make sense to make your goal the place where the tipping points are, like it should be below that. And so anyway, they started framing up around this like 2 degree goal around COP16. And then they also made this, and this is having a huge effect on today's conversations as well. So they did this in 2010, was they made the Green Climate Fund commitment and said they wanted to get to $100 billion per year by 2020. And developed nations would do that. And guess what? That hasn't happened. And now we're in 2020. And so there is also this like serious gap that's starting to widen between countries, especially in the G20, where like G7 countries were like, we're going to make sure that you have the money, don't worry, and it's still not being there. And then now they're talking about a new finance goal, which is being completely undermined because the old finance goal wasn't even met. So how can you like talk about a new finance goal? And that climate finance tension is really present in these conversations currently, which is why this is important. So at COP17 in Durban, they decided they wanted to have a new agreement. At that time, they didn't know it would be in Paris. So it was just, we're going to make an agreement in 2015 to be implemented in 2020. And really wanted to make sure that all countries were included. So they made the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for enhanced action, which then became the Paris Agreement, basically. And that was where the negotiations of the Paris Agreement were taking place. And then COP18 in Doha, that's when we started entering the second commitment period for Kyoto Protocol. They were starting the review of long-term goal, and then really trying to reaffirm the climate finance, although that wasn't working very well. Warsaw was a really important COP because of there's like two or three conversations that were happening. First, this was where INDCs were created, which is the intended nationally determined contributions, which are now nationally determined contributions, but at that time they were intended. So it's like, what are countries actually going to pledge to try to move this forward? So that was where that concept first came up. Then there's also conversation about like monitoring, reporting, and verification, which has to do with like the transparency, like how do you make sure what you are committing gets monitored, reported, verified, and that also with or carbon markets, how do we make sure that things are being traded appropriately as well? And then also the mechanism for loss and damage came up in Warsaw. There was Typhoon Haiyan that had hit the Philippines, and the negotiator Yebsano, who is the Philippines negotiator, was trying to deal with like connecting with his family while he was negotiating. And it was really brought to light, like loss and damage had been talked about for years, but this is loss and damage for like us when he was referencing the Philippines, and there needs to be something. So when you hear about the Warsaw International Mechanism, it's because it came from the Warsaw COP, and that's where the loss and damage conversations are coming in. Which brings us to Paris. So with Paris, basically, the agreement is that we want to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius with a 2 degrees Celsius max. There's supposed to be nationally determined contributions that the intended ones were submitted in 2015, and the hope was that every 5 years they were going to come back and be able to provide new ones, which were just done. Not everyone has submitted their new nationally determined contribution, but a lot of countries have. And I will also send links to how you can find that online. There's a discussion about how to peak emissions and work to decrease emissions, loss and damage discussions, and adaptation. These were some of like the core components. And since we don't so what I want to do next time, because I know we're running out of time too, but I'd like to go more into the Paris Agreement and talk about like the specifics around this and like what is currently being negotiated. There are a couple different things that are like really being talked about right now with the Paris Agreement. And you probably have heard a little bit about it, but like basically once you agreed to the Paris Agreement, what negotiators needed to do from that point was to agree on a rule book about how the implementation works. So you're going to hear a lot about this Paris rule book conversation and like how that all is shaping up, and what are countries allowed to do and what are they not allowed to do, and how does it get all counted, and all of this stuff is all being still decided, and it was supposed to all be decided within the period of 2015 to 2020 when the agreement was really going to take place. So that is being talked about significantly. So is the global stock take, thinking through how are we as a global community thinking about like what are we all contributing or not contributing, and where do we need to go from there, and then whose long-term goals are affecting that. Like that is all a very active conversation right now. And then that's kind of also where like fair shares conversation also comes in about like who is really or responsible for different pieces of this given historical emissions. And that's also where you start coming into climate reparations and things like that.